Okay, so let's move right along here. We're going to do some slightly more difficult problems based on some more advanced syllabus from Algebra 2. We're going to start now looking at complex numbers. Okay, you may remember complex numbers from the letter I. Remember that I is equal to the square root of -1. Okay, we don't need to use that so much when we do addition or subtraction, but we do need to use that a lot when we use multiplication or division. Let's go ahead and do some subtraction. We've got some complex number subtraction up here. We've got -4 minus 3i minus, and the minus is in front of a parentheses, 8 plus 4i. Recall how we do this. We can take the parentheses off the first set, because there's only a 1 implied in front of it, but there's a -1 implied in front of this parenthesis. So we've got to distribute that -1 over both of these terms that are added. So we really have -8 minus 4i here. In order to do this, we need to combine like terms. Remember, numbers are like terms, and imaginary numbers are like terms. Real numbers and imaginary numbers are separate. So we have to look at our real numbers. We've got a -4 here. We've got a -8 there. That gives us -12. We're done with that part. We've got a -3 here, a -3i here. We've got a -4i over there. That gives us -3 plus -4 is -7i. Okay, so the answer to this problem is -12 minus 7i. Okay, good. I'm not going to do addition for you because addition is easier than that. But I'm going to do 1 or 2 multiplication problems. We've got a multiplication problem right above here. This one is a more simple type. This one asks us to multiply 7i times 6i times 5i. Well, so remember that if you know I is the square root of -1, 7i times 6i times 5i is really the same thing as 7 times the square root of -1 times 6 times the square root of -1 times 5 times the square root of -1. Okay, and these are all being multiplied by each other, so multiplication is associative. You can multiply in any order you want to multiply. So we can group the 7 times the 6 times the 5 together, and we can group all of our -1 square roots, which are our 3 i's, together. Okay, so let's do that. So let's first solve the first 3 factors. What is 7 times 6 times 5? Well, I kind of think of it in reverse. I know 5 times 6 is 30, and 30 times 7 is 210. So I've got 210. Good. What is the square root of -1 times the square root of -1? Well, when you multiply a square root by itself, you end up with the factor underneath. So that product is -1. And what is this? That we've done this. We've now done this. That leaves us just this factor, this last factor left over. What is the square root of -1? We said that's I. So this is I. So we've got 210 times -1 times I, which is the same thing as -210 times I. That is the answer to this simple complex number multiplication. Well, let's do a more difficult complex number multiplication. Here we have one over here where we've got -1 minus 3i times 1 minus 8i. Okay, so this looks very much like a polynomial for good reason. We're going to multiply it very much the way we would multiply a polynomial. So let's go ahead and let's do it using FOIL. There's many different ways to do it, but FOIL is good enough. So FOIL means we're going to start with the first factors. So that would be, what's the first? Here is -1 times 1. O, we would multiply the outer factors. This is -1 times -8i. I would be the inner factors. Let me zoom out just a bit. I would be the inner factor. That would be -3i times 1 times positive 1 over here. And L would be the last two factors, okay? Negative 3i and negative 8i. So we multiply those two together. So now what we have to do is multiply these out, add them together, and we're done. Negative 1 times 1 is negative 1. Negative 1 times negative 8i is positive 8i. Negative 3i times 1 is negative 3i. And negative 3i times negative 8i is the same thing as negative 3 times negative 8 times I squared. Okay, because we just multiply I times I. Well, let's figure out what is this. Can we simplify this a bit? Let's try. Negative 3 times negative 8, 8, 16, 24 is positive 24, I squared. But I squared is negative 1, so this is negative 24. Okay, so we've got to add up these four factors, negative 1, 8i, negative 3i, and negative 24. Remember, that's basically what we ended up with for this last factor. We have to combine like terms. So we'll have to take the negative 1 and the negative 24 together, which add up to negative 25. And we have to take the 8i and the minus 3i, which add up to 5i. So the answer is 5i minus 25. And this could sometimes be written. Sometimes we try to write the real number before the imaginary number. So we could also write this. It's the same thing as negative 25 plus 5i. Okay, so that would be the answer to that multiplication. Let's do some division problems. We've got a division problem involving imaginary numbers here, where we've got this question, negative 10 over 10i. Let's copy that over here, negative 10 over 10i. What is that equal to? How can we simplify it? Well, simplifying complex division usually implies that what we need to do is remove the I from the denominator. We do not want to have an imaginary number or a radical in the denominator, but in this case, we have an imaginary number. You should kind of remember an imaginary number is a radical. Okay, imaginary number I is the square root of negative 1. So that's one of the reasons why we don't want to have it in the denominator. So the way we get rid of it is we multiply. The simplest way to do it is to somehow get rid of the I. We know that I times I is negative 1, and that would get rid of the imaginary part. So we can multiply this fraction by I over I. Okay, I in other words. Okay, so when we multiply two fractions, we multiply across numerators and we multiply across denominators. So we've got, and we can put this negative with the negative 10 in the numerators. It's really our choice where we want to put the negative sign. If it's in front of a fraction, I'll just arbitrarily choose to put it in front of the numerator. So we've got negative 10 times I, which is negative 10i. And in the denominator, we've got 10i times I, which is 10i squared. But we said that I squared is equal to negative 1. So the denominator is really negative 10. Our numerator, again, is negative 10i. So what happens is the negative 10s cancel out, and we are left with I. And that is the answer to this problem. Okay, so the answer here is I. It kind of simplifies very, very dramatically. This will be the end of part 2. In part 3, we're going to look at how to simplify a more complex, a more complicated complex fraction.